The day Mark lost his job, the air had a distinct chill, though it wasn't quite winter yet. He remembered the sound of his boss's voice, dispassionate and rehearsed, as if the words had been practiced many times before. "We have to let you go." It was as if the world had paused for a moment, letting those words sink in before time resumed. He had seen the layoffs coming. Everyone had, but like most people, he had hoped he might be spared. He'd given 10 years to the company, working late, missing his kids' soccer games and school recitals, believing that hard work would shield him from these kinds of catastrophes. Now, as he packed up the contents of his desk, pictures of his wife and 2 boys, a motivational calendar with quotes about perseverance, and a few awards that now felt meaningless, Mark realized that the future he had envisioned was no longer certain. What terrified him most wasn't the job loss itself, but the creeping dread of what it would mean for his family. They depended on his income. He was their provider, their rock. At home, Mark tried to put on a brave face. He didn't want to worry his wife, Julia, or the boys. Julia was doing part-time work at a local cafe, but her paycheck barely covered groceries. As they sat at the dinner table that night, he searched for the right moment to tell her. His sons, Liam and Sam, were talking excitedly about their day at school, completely unaware of the storm brewing in their father's mind. He couldn't bring himself to ruin the moment. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, he broke the news to Julia. Her face fell as the words left his mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mark, what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We've already got the mortgage, the car payments, the boys' school expenses. We can't afford this." "I know," he replied, his voice quiet. "I'll figure something out. I promise." But he wasn't sure how he'd keep that promise. They had some savings, but not enough to last them more than a few months. He spent the next few weeks obsessively searching for jobs, applying to dozens of positions every day. The rejections came just as quickly. Every "thank you for your interest" email felt like another weight added to the crushing burden already on his shoulders. His confidence, once steady, was eroding. As the weeks turned into months, Mark found himself slipping further into a quiet desperation. Their savings were dwindling and the bills were piling up. He avoided opening the mail, knowing that most of the envelopes contained reminders of payments that were past due. The anxiety gnawed at him constantly. He couldn't sleep, and when he did, he dreamt of drowning, of being pulled under, struggling to breathe as the water closed in. Julia did her best to stay strong, but the stress was evident in the way her face had grown more tired, her smiles rarer. The tension in their home became palpable. Little things that had never mattered before became points of contention. How much they spent on groceries, whether the boys really needed new shoes, if the heat needed to stay on all day. Mark hated the way money, or rather the lack of it, now coloured every conversation. It made him feel small, like a failure. One evening, as they sat together in the dim light of their living room, Mark let out a long, exhausted sigh. "I'm sorry," he said, staring down at his hands. "I should have seen this coming. I should have been more prepared." Julia reached over, placing a hand on his knee. "It's not your fault. We couldn't have predicted this." But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had let his family down. Each day without work felt like a slow unravelling of the life they had built together. One day, while checking the mail, Mark found a letter from the bank. It was a foreclosure notice on their home. He felt his stomach drop as he read the words, his vision blurring with panic. He stumbled back inside, gripping the notice tightly, trying to calm his racing heart. "Julia," he called out, his voice shaky. When she saw the letter in his hand, her face went pale. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered. They sat at the kitchen table, staring at the notice in silence. The house had been their sanctuary, the place where their boys had grown up, where they had built a life together. The thought of losing it felt unbearable, but they had missed too many payments, and there was no way to catch up. The next few weeks were a blur of packing, tears, and difficult conversations with the boys. They found a small apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the home they had once known. The boys didn't understand why they had to move, why they couldn't stay in their rooms or play in the backyard. Mark didn't know how to explain it in a way that made sense to them. It felt like he had failed them in the most fundamental way. In their new apartment, the reality of their situation hit harder. The once bustling family home had been replaced by a cramped two-bedroom unit where privacy was a luxury. Liam and Sam shared a small room, and Mark could see the confusion in their eyes, the way they quietly tried to adjust to the new normal without asking too many questions. It broke his heart to see them tiptoeing around the subject, knowing they didn't fully understand why everything had changed. Mark's relationship with Julia began to fray under the pressure. Arguments, once rare, became more frequent. They bickered about the smallest things: how much Julia was working, how Mark spent his time job hunting, and whether they could afford small luxuries like pizza on Friday nights. The weight of their financial struggles seeped into every corner of their lives, making it hard to find moments of peace. Months passed, and with each day that Mark remained unemployed, his sense of self-worth deteriorated. He stopped shaving, stopped caring about his appearance. He avoided social gatherings, embarrassed to admit that he still hadn't found work. Friends and former colleagues reached out less frequently, and when they did, it was with the kind of pity that made him feel even smaller. One morning, after yet another rejection, Mark sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the blank wall in front of him. He had spent hours the night before applying for jobs, each one more disheartening than the last. He felt like he was throwing darts at a dartboard blindfolded, hoping something would stick, but nothing ever did. He was running out of time, out of hope, out of everything. In that moment, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The fear, the guilt, the anger, it all came crashing in. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed, the kind of deep guttural sobs that come when you've been holding everything in for too long. That night, as he lay awake next to Julia, staring at the ceiling, he whispered, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Julia turned to him, her voice soft in the dark. "We're going to get through this, Mark. I don't know how, but we will." Her words were meant to be comforting, but to Mark, they felt like a lie. He couldn't see a way out. The walls were closing in, and no amount of optimism could change the reality they were facing. But there was something in Julia's voice, something he hadn't noticed in his own for a long time: hope. She hadn't given up on him, even if he had. The turning point came unexpectedly. It wasn't a sudden windfall or a stroke of luck, but rather a slow realization that he couldn't keep spiraling down. One morning, as he was walking Liam to school, his son tugged on his sleeve and asked, "Dad, when are you going to get another job?" The innocence in Liam's question stung, but it also shook something loose inside of Mark. He realized that while he couldn't control the economy or the job market, he could control how he responded to his circumstances. He had let his fear paralyze him, but his family needed more than that. They needed him to keep trying, even if it felt impossible. With renewed determination, Mark approached his job search differently. Instead of solely focusing on positions similar to his previous role, he started applying to jobs he hadn't considered before. He took freelance gigs, side jobs, anything that would bring in some income. It wasn't glamorous work, delivering groceries, fixing computers for neighbors, driving for ride-sharing apps, but it was something, and each paycheck, no matter how small, felt like a step in the right direction. The money wasn't enough to fix everything, but it bought them time. Mark's confidence, once shattered, slowly began to rebuild as he realized that providing for his family wasn't just about having a high-paying job. It was about doing whatever it took to make sure they had what they needed. Over time, the arguments with Julia became less frequent. They were still struggling, still living paycheck to paycheck, but there was a sense of partnership again, of facing the hardship together rather than letting it tear them apart. They started having small family outings again, picnics in the park, movie nights at home, and for the first time in a long time, laughter filled the apartment. One day, after nearly a year of struggling, Mark received an email from a company he had applied to months earlier. They were offering him a full-time position. It wasn't the job he had lost, but it was stable, with benefits, and enough to get them back on their feet. He accepted immediately. When he told Julia, they both cried. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of exhaustion from the battle they had fought together. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they were no longer drowning. Looking back on the past year, Mark realized that the struggle had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had learned the true meaning of resilience, not just surviving hardship, but finding the strength to keep going when everything seemed lost. He had discovered that success wasn't about the size of his paycheck, but about the small victories along the way, the moments of joy he had once taken for granted. His family had been through the worst, but they had come out stronger on the other side. And as Mark stood in their small apartment, looking at the people who meant more to him than anything, he knew that no amount of money could ever replace the value of that.